Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining on such a fantastic Wednesday afternoon. Today's topic is no surprise to anyone. We're looking at Attack Rewind, deep dive into modernized legacy exploits, and I'm joined by two wonderful powerhouses within the cybersecurity space. First of all, none of these folks need an introduction, but again, as a courtesy, I'm introducing Parul Khanna, who's the Director of Information Security at Cineplex, followed by Kanishka Bansal, who's the Lead Information Security Consultant as Control Gap Inc. Thank you for joining me on such a wonderful virtual event today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Akshay. It's a pleasure.
Awesome.
Likewise as well. I'm looking forward to sharing this stage today and talking more about this interesting topic.
Fantastic. Well, glad to have you folks here. Again, the topic for discussion today is really looking at how we've expanded and grown as an organization and the ecosystem in general. There's still the threat vector when it comes to legacy exploits still being exploited by bad actors. The notorious one for this conversation is Eternal Blue. I mean, when it comes to its reference and the exploitation of the SMB version 1, causing havoc across the verticals, whether that's public and private. Again, my work comes as an enterprise architect on both the public and private spaces, and we saw the havoc that's caused by non-patchy as well as WannaCry. I wanted to start by understanding from your own viewpoints, Pearl, and then we'll move on to Kanishka. How have you seen these legacy exploits, such as Eternal Blue, such as the vulnerability that was inherently there with SMB version 1, exploited then, and what are the threat landscapes as we see them being exploited right now?
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Parul. So old exploits like Eternal Blue aren't just used as entry points anymore. They're the first move in a chain of attacks. So we tend to treat legacy exploit as old news, assuming they have been patched out and they're out of relevance. But attackers, bad malicious actors, see them as low cost, low noise tools with high rewards, especially when they're combined with modern delivery methods. So half of the reason, personally, what I've seen in the industry, the legacy exploits still exist and work is because the organization don't know what is still running. Asset management and exposure mapping aren't exciting, but these are like the fundamental keys to keep track what is in your environment and what is being exploited. So if you don't know what's in your house, you cannot protect it. And honestly, it's not what attackers do when they exploit, but after they get in, they try to use modern tools to hide, spread, or even sell your access to others. So that level of creativity is hard to defend against if the asset management isn't there. And as you touch base on tech debt, is like the biggest fundamental key in organization trying to move away from legacy architecture to their modern architecture.
Well, that's a fair point. And I think when it comes to tech debt, because this particular vulnerability that we're talking about impacted anything from Vista all the way to 10, and from a server standpoint, I believe it was 2008 all the way to 16. Now, I know for a fact there are organizations both within the public and private verticals that are running not only those OSs, but those server platforms as well, because there's the inherent dependency on applications and the business capabilities that are supported by those applications. Now, when we talk about the vulnerability or the exploit mechanism, whether that's a heap spray attack, shellcode delivery, or just kernel mode exploitation, which are notorious in itself, what are some sort of hardening capabilities that organizations can look at, whether that's inherit their own extended detect response capabilities or working with third parties to make sure that they have a layered approach to mitigate these risks that as they come up?
I would say don't treat vulnerabilities as isolated issues. Treat them as part of an attack chain. So replace, segment, or isolate old system. If you cannot remove them, lock them down, segment them, monitor them, especially log them, restrict access. So zero architecture is a big fundamental tool that a lot of organizations are adopting. So if you don't need access, just-in-time access is one of the things that industry is moving towards. And obviously, there are a lot of tools out there like EDR or UBA that detect weird behavior, not just like any malicious file. So adopting these technology with this strict governance and policy structure would be the key.
Right, yeah, I would agree to it. I think like a layered approach, as we hinted to before, especially like a defense in depth is paramount when we especially have systems or components with legacy vulnerabilities. In terms of like the security controls, yes, we can definitely have some compensating controls in place if it's not possible to patch these vulnerabilities, and especially if these systems and components are something which is more of like public faces, such as like onboarding the applications to a web application firewall and making sure that there are like stricter policies and like stricter access controls in place. Um, yeah, I think it's all about like what level of controls do we have, and like what level of like the stronger detection mechanisms which we have. So for instance, if there is a chance that there is a legacy vulnerability that has been exploited and we observe there is a lateral movement across our systems, do we have our endpoint tools being able to detect such kind of like lateral movement, or maybe like even a privilege escalation in place? So it's paramount that we do have stronger detection mechanisms, that the signatures are up to date, and in terms of the security controls, we are following something like defense in depth, having a zero trust architecture, like trust but always verify. And if there is anomalies or deviations which is seen, then making sure that we are having, a second factor of authentication as well in place.
And that's a valid point. And, sorry, go ahead, Krishna.
One point I like to add. Parul mentioned regarding compensating controls. So a lot of things exist in silos, and whether it's a small company or big company, so make it as a business problem, not just ITs, because a lot of risk, whether it's a legacy risk, IT risk, need input from compliance risk, ops, leadership to solve it realistically and have a plan in place to not just have like just a plan to cover it up, but actually remove it from its root.
That's a valid point. So let me touch upon that particular point, Kanishka, is that when it comes to organization, yes, there's checks and balances that you can have in place and make it a business problem that you mentioned. But when it comes to your own experiences with it, change is, I think it stops at the weakest part of the link, which is human interactions of any software, and interaction with human change management is quite a peak that needs to be, again, at some point in time. But when it comes to change management and driving this business problem mindset that it's beyond IT now, what are some of the challenges and roadmaps that you or roadblocks that you've seen with mitigating some of these challenges?
So we have seen the top-down approach. So once that approach is in place and everybody has been trained on what are the right strategies or what are the right processes to follow. So for example, a lot of legacy systems have these exploitable vulnerabilities, and these legacy systems have been grandfathered in from like previous teams, whether it's a public sector or private sector or smaller business, smaller private companies. A lot of these companies have grandfathered systems. So it's hard to know what's going on. So the change management is a key to have a lot of eyes on a particular change, whether it could be a compliance or a risk team or operation team or architecture team. If you have a lot of eyes, there's going to be a solution, and eventually a business will get involved to see why are we still spending so much money and effort and time in resolving this one thing that can be replaced. And with AI, with cloud architecture, a lot of things are moving into cloud. So it's easier to establish that change management, and it just helps you develop that mentality of like, hey, somebody needs to be in charge of this and make decision before it's implemented. Or if we have find out that SMB version 1 is enabled for some reason because it was forgotten or it wasn't hardened, change management was there to see who approved it or why it was missed.
That's a valid point. Parul, would you like to add on to that?
Yes, and to kind of like build up on that, I feel more or less like a cultural shift in terms of the mindset is needed. So when we see like a particular problem, if there is a tech debt that is continuously building up, so if all the relevant stakeholders should take it as their like accountability and responsibility in order to resolve it, instead of pointing that this is IT's problem or this is particularly like business's problem, etc. Collaboration amongst the stakeholders is another important factor, like where we communicate, where we see, like where we prioritize, like what exactly is something which we can resolve as a team in terms of the resources as well as the budget. What is the risk level? What is the severity? So we decide upon that as a team, and then we contribute accordingly. Shift risk left is another terminology which I would like to emphasize on, and which technically means that if we consider that if we are able to resolve these vulnerabilities when we are, building things from the scratch, and when we are like designing the things, and when we are able to identify these vulnerabilities and resolve them earlier in the development cycle. So there's nothing like that. I mean, like that help resolves a lot of these vulnerabilities, and that help gets rid of a lot of like the tech debt, which gets rolled towards the end. And then we are finally like having challenges in resolving or in like prioritizing like what are vulnerabilities which we want to resolve. So shift risk left is definitely requires more or less like a cultural change like within the organizations, where we embed security early into the development cycle, and where we see that if there are vulnerabilities, especially outdated vulnerabilities, yes, we're able to remediate those before the things actually go into the production.
That makes sense. And one thing I'll touch upon that, Parul, is that you mentioned a point earlier when it comes to the conversation about shift left, also adding on to the previous point that you made about network segmentation. The network segmentation has been around. So it's been around as a best practice for quite some time, but it's still quite prevalent that organizations don't have their networks segmented. And when it comes to lateral movement, can you touch upon this vulnerability as well as other legacy exploits? How important is to understand your network architecture and understand the importance of segmentation to mitigate such risks?
Yeah, it's sorry, go ahead, Kanishka. Yeah.
So one of the key criteria for this exploitable vulnerability was it was easy to move, and with a lot of modernization, it is no longer running on a file-based malware. So once in your system, it can move laterally without your technology can even detect it. So network segment is the key, and a lot of compliance frameworks. So if you're going through like ISO 27001 or NIST or DSS, like a lot of these frameworks recommend and require that your network is segmented. So even if a particular network is infected, at least it's contained and easier to detect and remediate, rather than your whole corporate, or like if you're running critical infrastructure, your whole critical infrastructure getting infected. It's not just come with like a lot of compliance issue, but if you are in public sector, it could be your reputation, or it could be critical infrastructure going down.
Yeah, yes, I would add to that. Like, yes, understanding your network architecture, like your network components, is quite important because you should be aware, like, where exactly the switches, routers, and everything is, like, how exactly the network topology is, because that helps you get an understanding of what the attack surface is. Now, there are like good amount of like tools available, some of them publicly freely available as well, in terms of designing your network and then creating like a threat model of it and understanding what are some of the risks, like what are some of the ways in which your network can be breached, and then what exactly are some of the countermeasures. So good examples of some of these tools, for example, your OWASP threat tracker, your iris risk. So these are excellent tools for your threat modeling, and they help you get more understanding about your network so that you're able to expand on the attack surface. So yes, I think it's quite important that you have a solid understanding your components, your network diagram, your architecture, and then from there on you take on like, okay, how exactly the designing, and you take things to production from there.
It makes sense. And as a public servant myself, the organizations that I work with and I have partnered with in the past, I think that's a conversation that's worth having now, because again, the private verticals do move faster as compared to the public, and again, there are inherent pros and cons there as well. I'm going to step on another topic worth mentioning, is that when it comes to work with partners or building like ecosystems of trust, supply chain is a vector that's quite malicious in itself if it's exploited. But when it comes to doing partnership with organization, when you are building your own partner ecosystem, is there checks and balances that you have built internally to make sure that you're not inheriting the partners' vulnerabilities to your own ecosystems? If you could touch upon that, we'll start with Pearl and then move on to Kanishka.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would suggest that in terms of relying on if the with respect to supply chain or the third party integrations or dependencies, it's always important that we have our own due diligence. For example, if there are any third party for developers using any third party components libraries, we scan those third parties using any of the tools, such as your software composition analysis, such as example being like SNCC. So it's important that we do our due diligence on that in that cases. SBOM, which is Software Bill of Materials, is another widely used term which gives you an idea of if you're using any third-party software binaries or library packages, what are some of the vulnerabilities present in those. Like it gives you a whole, like it's a whole document which says like when was it created, when was it updated, what kind of like dependencies does it have, like what was resolved and what's the risk. Like it gives you everything, like an inventory of that, basically the third-party library that you're using. So it's important to do, like as an organization, if I'm associating with any of the vendor or like a, like a third party, it's important to do like a due diligence in such cases and making sure that whatever we are procuring, we are doing our own checks, like our own security and gating checks to ensure that these components are free of the vulnerabilities. And if the vulnerabilities still exist, then we do have, as we mentioned before, as we hinted to before, compensating controls in place or like other security controls in place in order to protect like these vulnerabilities are not getting exploited.
Yeah. Uh, I have seen third-party breaches, and vendors are the main culprit when it comes to your security breaches, because you yourself will be confident about your security, but you need to take the same assurance and same steps to make sure your vendors are and your partners are also taking the same proactive measures. So, making sure like your contracts have clear terms around security standards, especially like addressing any tech debt or patching. Like if there is a critical or high security patch which is currently exploiting, you need to have a timeline in place, like how long it's going to take you to patch that system, and or you can have or you can ask for penalties if outdated systems or insecure protocols are found, and just doing that ongoing maintenance and monitoring. So due diligence is a key to make sure that your vendor is secure when it's onboarded. And if you have a good inventory and good diagrams or good understanding of your network, which we touched base earlier, you need to know where you're placing that vendor or their tools and how are they going to flow in your environment, how are they collecting the data, and implementing tool that allows you to continuously monitor any supply chain networks and vendor interactions would be the path forward, because this can help detect breaches or anomalies in real time, especially from our partners using, let's say, outdated systems, and fostering that open communication channels with the partners where you or your tech team or your architecture team has a good dialogue open, and they can build that trust to ensure that if any issues are found or they're exploited, they're addressed before it's escalated.
No, that makes sense. And I think Kanishka, you touched upon a very key point that's near and dear to my heart is when you're working with your own SOC and you're working with what does your organization footprint mean when it comes to MDR, XDR capabilities. If you could expand on the fact that how important is for organization, all shapes and sizes, to understand that when it comes to a partnership with your own SOC or an MDR tool that you're incorporating, you really need to move away from a file-based understanding of and moving into a heuristic signature-based movement, because lateral movement is where things start making noise. But the sooner that you detect these things, the better it is. And how important is to start your journey with a partner that has these capabilities that does signature-based detection.
Yeah, because a lot of the modernization techniques involve that these tools are using native technology or native tools that are already part of, let's say, your Windows or Linux systems. They're no longer file-based. So having tools like such as EDR is a key, and not all EDRs are equal. So visibility is only as good as your configuration. So focus should be on like fileless activity detections, correlating like SMB version 1 use with suspicious behavior, alerting for misuse of any signed binaries, or detecting persistence via registry modes or scheduled tasks. Because a malware can exist in your environment, but you need to have proper logging in place and correlation in place so your SOC team can see, hey, why this PowerShell was running at 12 a.m. at midnight. Like it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and I think like a lot of times with these tools, yes, it's important to do our due diligence in terms of like what we are leveraging, what's the benefit that we are getting out of these tools. The tools like are have updated signatures in place so that anything which is, like if we have like a malware or any other malicious thing into our systems, yeah, these tools are able to detect those. So one of the challenges I see like a lot of times the organizations run into is that we do have a lot of false positives or like benign activities in place. Like these tools generate a lot of noise. So it's important that we continue to analyze those and see like how we can fine tune our tools optimally, and also making sure that the tools have holistic and comprehensive coverage, meaning that they do span over our entire network. They do cover all the important assets, all the critical assets that we want them to cover, and they do are like sending the alerts and having that correlation in place. So that's because the tool is as good as like the configuration, right? Like we cannot protect something which we don't or which we aren't which we don't know about. So it's very important that we configure the tools to make sure that we have a comprehensive coverage in place, and then all these false positives and the benign activities we can, as like it's more or less like a repetitive process. We continue to get rid of them, like lower them to a like a lower priority, like something which is more or less like a low or medium risk and not something like high risk, so that the team actually gets to focus on what is actually the relevant investigations or the incidents.
Well, that's a valid point. And I think one of the notes that I was making here is that when it comes to if someone's listening to this conversation right now and they're not aware of their threat landscape, well, it will be a different conversation entirely. But when it comes to understanding and taking away the key aspects and revisiting their own threat landscape, what five things then an organization could do, understanding that, you know what, for example, as a public sector employee, I can and say this with absolute transparency, there are workloads right now, there are applications that are supporting key businesses that should have been put to rest a while ago, but that's not the case. The case is we have a lot of human knowledge, vested interest within these applications that sustain key critical business operations for us. And for us is to start thinking about what is the art of the possible, what is the transition onto a much sustainable, modernized ecosystem. But not everyone's ready. But to give these folks a sanity check, what are the top five things that they can do to rest assured that they have a plan in place instead of having no plan, to not only address these challenges and the threat vector that's constantly evolving, but what is something that is tangible for them to take away from this conversation? Kanishka, I'll start with you and then we'll pass it on to Pearl.
Yep. So I think the one thing everybody, whether it's a small or big company, would do is identifying all systems in their environment, whether they are part of your critical infrastructure segment or non-critical, and from there identify if they're using legacy protocols or they are outdated OSs, and from there build a risk-based roadmap for removing or replacing any legacy tech or assigning ownership and get that exec buy-in and track that progress. So it doesn't have to be do weekly calls with the execs, but like quarterly calls or semi-annually calls, as long as that progress is being done. I think that's a key because you not everybody has the budget and or efforts or employees to remediate everything at once. So prioritizing is the key. Start from the high priority items and then move your way towards your low priority tickets items. And yeah, so those will be like high priority things you can do. And then prioritizing patch management, making sure you are making use of good tools, like you're making use of behavioral analytics tools that will help you do um, endpoint detection response and help detect that malicious activity that might not be detected by any outdated malware software.
Yeah, I would just echo that point. I think the beginning, we need to have like a comprehensive inventory. Like we need to know what are the critical assets that we need to protect, and then further in terms of like having a vulnerability scan, so regular vulnerability scanning, knowing that which all assets, which all of these critical assets are vulnerable, have the legacy vulnerabilities, and then just planning a roadmap ahead of the line in terms of prioritizing and remediating these vulnerabilities. Now, when we are trying or when we are planning to build systems from scratch, when we are redefining things, etc., then it's important to have that shift risk left mindset where we are making sure that the vulnerabilities get remediated at an earlier stage rather than just moving like towards the tech debt or to the very end where we again struggle with prioritizing and collaborating with all the stakeholders and then planning on the budget and the resources. So I think it's important to have a good understanding of what are the vulnerable components within your network, and then finally go about from there in terms of prioritizing, having the compensating controls, the layered approach in terms of defense in depth, multi-factor authentication, zero trust architecture. So those are essentials. And I think like a balance of all these will make sure that you have like a strong, robust like security posture. But it's also important that you continuously evaluate, continuously revisit it so as to make sure that you are up to date. And if there's something which is end of life, which is being decommissioned, you make sure you take appropriate steps to replace it. If there is a third party vendor that you're relying on, you do your own due diligence in terms of scanning, in terms of having the software bill of materials, or in terms of using a software composition analysis tool to make sure that the third party libraries or binaries are free of any vulnerabilities. So I think like an amalgamation of all these steps will help ensure that yes, you are protected of any of the legacy vulnerabilities. Like though it's impossible to eliminate all of the legacy vulnerabilities, but at least if you take like some, strengthen the security controls, have those guardrails around, you'll make sure that yes, the risk is like to minimum.
That makes sense. I think I'm making notes here. So it goes back to the foundation of maintaining adequate cyber hygiene, incorporating, again, tenets of zero trust architecture, making sure that you have those MFA in place as needed when needed. No, it's about, yes, you need to have those in place. It's not a conversation about a nice to, it's a must-have conversation. So I think incorporating the feedback that Parul, you've mentioned, I think I feel comfortable leaving the folks in a place of much needed sanity regarding how these legacy exploits are still quite vulnerable to the organizations that are facing a ever evolving threat landscape. And with that, I think we'll give the podium back to the folks. And I thank you for taking the time and sharing your knowledge and expertise to progress the cyber landscape. Thank you very much.
One thing I would like to add is cyber insurance. So that's the key. Like if you're not getting a buy-in from somebody that we need to turn this off, I'll point it to cyber insurance, because I bet like if you have a legacy system, if you have SMB version 1, your premium will go up or you will be uninsured. So I think that will be another thing to check when planning a path to mitigate or replace these systems.
That is a valid part, Kanishka, and I can relate to it very personally because I recently went through some of these changes. And when you fill out that long list of form that is highly needed, the more legacy components you put in place, the chances of your premium to go up is quite high. And you want to make sure that you put those checks and balances in place to be transparent, have a roadmap in place, and you account for clear transparency of, hey, I am getting rid of my tech debt, and hopefully the insurance carrier is nice to you and take that journeys on with you. Awesome stuff. Thank you very much, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.